The Verith called their assessment protocol the Cognition Threshold Survey. It had been in use for 180 years, applied to 64 species across the Verith expansion zone. Its purpose was to establish whether a newly encountered species met the threshold for sapient classification under Verith interstellar law, which was the legal framework that governed how the Verith treated other beings. Below the threshold, resource classification, the species and its biological material could be used as the Verith required. Above the threshold, sapient classification. The species was entitled to legal personhood under Verith law, with corresponding rights and protections. The Cognition Threshold Survey consisted of 17 components. It measured problem-solving capacity, language complexity, abstract reasoning, social organization, use of tools, evidence of cultural transmission, and 10 other factors that the Verith legal framework had developed over its history as indicators of the cognitive level that distinguished persons from resources. The survey had correctly identified 6 species as sapient in its 180 years of use. It had incorrectly identified 1. The survey team arrived at Earth in 2241. There were 5 of them: a cognitive assessment specialist, a biological classifier to field operatives, and a legal documentation officer. They had the equipment for the survey and the authority to conduct it, and the understanding that their findings would be final. The survey was not announced. Standard protocol. An announced survey of a potentially sapient species introduced the variable of performance, which the Verith legal framework explicitly sought to eliminate from the assessment. Species assessed under unannounced conditions produced natural behavioral data. Species aware of assessment produced strategic behavioral data. Natural data was the legally valid basis for classification. Strategic data was not. The survey team spent 42 days observing humanity. They observed from a vessel in high orbit and from concealed ground-based observation posts at 7 sites. They had access to electromagnetic communication intercepts, visual observation, and biological sampling. Their assessment was comprehensive. Their assessment was wrong. The cognitive assessment specialist was named Seth Rao. She had performed the survey on 11 other species over a 20-year career and had been selected for the Earth survey. Because of her experience, and because the preliminary sensor data had suggested an unusually complex biological profile that warranted a senior specialist. She filed her assessment on day 42. The assessment was 340 pages. Its conclusion was that humanity did not meet the cognition threshold for sapient classification. The assessment's reasoning was extensive and detailed, and within the framework it was using, internally consistent. The framework was the problem. The Cognition Threshold Survey had been calibrated on the species the Verith had encountered before humanity. All of those species communicated through primary sensory channels that the Verith surveyed effectively: visual signals, pheromonal signals, acoustic signals in frequency ranges that the survey equipment monitored. All of those species' most complex cognitive activity was expressed in the channels that the survey measured. The survey measured what it had been designed to measure, and what it had been designed to measure was what the species it had been calibrated on expressed externally. Humans communicated primarily through language, which the Verith survey intercepted. The survey's language analysis component found human language syntactically complex and assessed it as probably the most linguistically sophisticated communication system the survey had encountered. But the survey's language analysis was designed to assess the sophistication of communications about observable events. Humans, the survey found, communicated extensively about observable events. They also communicated extensively about something the survey categorized as internal state expression. Communications, whose referent was not the external world, but the speaker's own cognitive and emotional state. The survey classified this second category as non-evidential for sapience. Communication about internal states was a feature of several resource-classified species that used vocalizations to signal distress or contentment. It was not, by the Verith framework, evidence of the abstract reasoning that sapience required. What the survey had misclassified, in the language analysis alone, was the entirety of human fiction. Philosophy, internal dialogue, emotional communication, hypothetical reasoning, and the specific human cognitive practice of modeling other minds. These were not internal state expression in the survey's sense. They were the most sophisticated cognitive activity humanity performed. They happened to be expressed in a channel that the survey's framework had pre-categorized as non-evidential. The survey found other deficiencies by the same mechanism. The abstract reasoning component required subjects to demonstrate reasoning about entities not present in the immediate environment. The survey's assessment protocol looked for behavioral evidence of this reasoning, using the behavioral indicators that had been established from the calibration species. It did not find the specific behavioral indicators it was looking for and concluded that human abstract reasoning capacity was limited. What the survey had missed was that humans did their abstract reasoning in their heads and expressed it in language that the survey had pre-categorized as non-evidential. The tool was looking in the wrong places for the right things. The result was a 340-page document that concluded, with the full authority of Verith law behind it, that humanity was a resource classification species. The legal documentation officer filed the classification on the 43rd day. The Verith Expansion Authority received the classification. The Expansion Authority issued the resource development permit. The survey team left. What happened next is the part of this story that Verith historians who have spent their careers analyzing it have described, with varying degrees of institutional discomfort, as the most expensive assessment error in the cognition threshold survey's history. The resource development program began in 2243, 2 years after the survey. Initial contact operations were conducted by a development fleet of 11 vessels, carrying the personnel and equipment for establishing a resource extraction operation on a newly classified planet. The development fleet's commander, Commodore Veth SAS, had overseen 5 previous resource development operations. He had a functioning protocol. He knew what to expect from a resource-classified species, encountering the Verith Expansion Authority for the first time. He did not know what to expect from humanity. He knew this within 30 minutes of initial contact. Initial contact protocol involved a standard approach to the primary population center, a visual and acoustic display designed to establish the Verath's technological superiority to the resource species, and a ground team deployment to begin the assessment of labor classification potential. The visual and acoustic display was designed to produce a specific response in resource-classified species. Behavioral submission. The display communicated, through channels that all biological organisms responded to at some level, that the encounter was with a significantly more powerful entity. The response to this communication, in resource-classified species, was retreat or stillness. The ground teams landed in what the survey data showed as a moderately dense human population area. The humans did not retreat. They also did not attack, which was the response protocol for species that were aggressive but subthreshold. They gathered. They observed the Verith ground teams with the specific quality of attention that Commodore Veth SAS's extensive experience with 12 species did not have a precedent for. They looked, he would later report, like they were assessing the situation. He attributed this to the behavioral complexity that even subthreshold species sometimes displayed and proceeded with the contact protocol. Then one of the humans walked forward and spoke. Not vocalized, not signaled, not displayed. Spoke in Verith. The survey team had been in orbit for 42 days and had intercepted Verith communications throughout. The survey team had used standard operational communication protocols, which included Verith language in its full technical register. The humans had been listening, not all of them. A specific group, which the survey's communication intercepts had noted but not analyzed for significance, had been working intensively on the intercepted communications for the full 42 days. The survey had not analyzed this group's activity for significance because the survey was looking for evidence of sapience in the specific forms it had been calibrated to find, and what this group was doing did not fit any of those forms. A group of humans spending 42 days listening to intercepted communications and working on decoding them did not register in the survey's framework as the abstract reasoning and cultural transmission that indicated sapience. In the Verith framework, this activity was not evidential for sapience. In the framework of what had actually just happened, a group of humans had, in 42 days, working from intercepted transmissions without dictionaries or grammar guides or any resource beyond what they could deduce and share with each other, built a functional working vocabulary and basic grammatical framework in a completely alien language. The human who walked forward and spoke to Commodore Vethesais was named Dr. Elena Acey Vasquez, and she was a linguist. She had been a linguist before the survey team arrived. She was the specific kind of linguist who specialized in language acquisition in adults learning structurally alien second languages, which was a field that existed because human languages were themselves diverse enough that learning some of them required adapting to cognitive frameworks very different from one's native language. She had spent 42 days applying the methodology of her professional specialization to a language that was more alien than any she had worked with before. She had done this because of the survey vessel, because something in orbit was watching, and she had concluded that the something watching was doing so for a reason, and that understanding the reason required understanding the something, and that understanding the something required its language. She had organized a team of 43 linguists, cognitive scientists, and communication specialists from 6 countries who had spent 42 days on this problem. 42 days. The Verith Assessment Survey had been designed and administered by senior specialists with purpose-built equipment, and it had concluded that human cognition did not meet the threshold for sapient classification. The humans had decided that the something watching them from orbit was interesting, and they had spent 42 days learning its language, and now one of them was standing in front of Commodore Vethesais and speaking it. She said, "In Verith, we would like to discuss the purpose of your survey." Commodore Vethesais, who had overseen 5 resource development operations and had never had a resource species speak to him in his own language, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "In Verith, you have been listening." She said, "Yes, we're good at that." She paused. "We would like to understand what you concluded from your survey, and why, and what you plan to do based on that conclusion." She paused. "We believe there may have been errors," Vethesais said. "You're speaking Verith." She said, "Functionally, yes. Our vocabulary is limited and our grammar is approximate, and there are probably errors I'm not aware of." She paused. "We've had 42 days." She paused. "If you're willing to give us more time, we'll improve." Vethesais looked at her. He said, "You learned this language in 42 days." She said, "My team did. I'm the most proficient." She paused. "We had good source material." He was quiet. She said, "Commodore, I want to be precise about what I'm asking. I'm asking for a formal review of the survey findings. I'm not asking you to change anything yet. I'm asking for the review to which I believe we are entitled under your legal." Framework if there are grounds to question the assessment, he said. You know our legal framework. She said. The language intercepts included legal communication. We prioritized it. She paused. The review provision is in Section 12 of the Cognition Threshold Protocol. We believe we have grounds. He said nothing. She said, Commodore. The survey concluded that we don't meet the threshold for sapient classification. She paused. I'm speaking your language. I'm citing your legal framework. I'm requesting a formal review process. She paused. I want you to tell me what a species has to do to demonstrate sapience to your assessment system, because I'm not sure what else I can offer you in the next 60 seconds. The formal review took for months. Not because the review process was slow. Because the Verith legal framework was careful. And careful processes took time, and the review's conclusions needed to be correct because the implications either way were significant. The review was conducted by a panel of 5 cognitive assessment specialists who had not been involved in the original survey. They had access to the original survey data and methodology. They also had access to something the original survey had not assessed, the 42 days of language acquisition work that Dr. HFY Vasquez's team had produced, which they reviewed with the specific attention of professionals encountering something they had not seen before. They had not seen this before. Not the outcome, which was remarkable. The process. The specific cognitive process by which 43 humans had organized themselves, distributed the analytical problem across the group, maintained consistent methodology across independent working teams, verified findings against each other's work, and built a cumulative understanding that no individual member of the team had achieved alone. This was the cognitive activity that the original survey had not detected. Not because it hadn't been happening, because the survey had been looking for cognitive complexity expressed in individual behavioral acts and had found it insufficient by that measure, and had not been calibrated to recognize cognitive complexity expressed through the organization of collective work. The review panel specialist in collective cognition, a researcher named Dr. Deathworld, who had spent her career studying the social dimension of problem solving, wrote in her panel contribution, the human species' most significant cognitive capacity is not individual intelligence, which by the survey's individual level assessment is high average, but not exceptional. It is what I am designating collective cognitive organization, the ability to distribute complex, analytical problems across a group, maintain coherent methodology across the distribution, and build cumulative understanding that exceeds individual capacity. This is the capability that produced the language acquisition result, and that the original survey's framework was not designed to detect. The original survey's framework was designed for species whose highest cognitive expressions are primarily individual acts. The human species' highest cognitive expressions are primarily collective. This is a systematic gap in the survey methodology that this review has identified and that should be addressed for future assessments. The review panel's conclusion was unanimous. Humanity met the cognition threshold. The resource development permit was rescinded. The development fleet, which had been holding position in Earth orbit awaiting the review conclusion, received the recall order. The legal documentation was filed. The expansion authority processed it. Commodore Vethesius remained in orbit throughout the 4-month review period. Not because protocol required it. Because he had been in the resource development program for 20 years and had never had an outcome like this and was finding that he had questions. On the day the review conclusion was filed, he requested a meeting with Dr. HFY Vasquez. She came aboard, which required a specific authorization that he filed without hesitation. They sat in the vessel's conference room and he said, I want to understand what happened. She said, which part? He said, 42 days. You didn't know what our language was. You didn't know if it was possible to learn. You spent 42 days trying. She said, we knew something was watching. We needed to know what. He said, most species, when they see something they don't understand in orbit, have one of a limited number of responses. They ignore it. They fear it. They worship it. He paused. You tried to learn its language. She said, ignoring it seemed inadvisable. Fearing it without understanding it seemed inefficient. She paused. Worshipping it seemed premature. He said, so you decided to understand it. She said, we decided to try to understand it. There's a difference. He said, what's the difference? She said, deciding to understand something implies confidence you'll succeed. Deciding to try implies you recognize you might fail and you're doing it anyway. She paused. We didn't know if we could learn your language. We knew we had to try. He thought about this. He said, the survey found you below the threshold. She said, yes. He said, do you know why? She said, we've thought about it. She paused. The survey was looking for cognition expressed individually. Our most sophisticated cognition is expressed collectively. She paused. The 42 days wasn't me. It was 43 people organized around a problem, each working on a part of it, sharing what they found, building something together. She paused. The survey watched us as individuals and found us average. We are average as individuals, he said, but collectively. She said, collectively we've been solving problems that we couldn't solve individually for, as long as we've been human. She paused. That's how we built everything we have. Not one person being very smart. A lot of people being organized around a problem. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the survey has classified 64 species. One previous reclassification in its 180-year history. She said, I know. He said, you looked up our survey records. She said, you had the records in your communication traffic. We translated them. He said, you translated our administrative records. She said, the language acquisition team's secondary project. Once we had basic vocabulary and grammar. The administrative records were good practice material. He looked at her. She said, we were thorough. He said, clearly. He paused. What are you going to do with the records? She said, that depends on what the reclassification produces and what our relationship with the expansion authority looks like going forward. She paused. We've seen what resource classification means. She paused. We have a strong preference for understanding the legal system that almost applied to us. He said, that's prudent. She said, we think so. He said, what would you have done if the review had upheld the original classification? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I don't know. She paused. What I know is that we wouldn't have accepted it without a response. She paused. What the response would have been, I can't tell you, because we didn't plan for that outcome. She paused. We planned for the outcome we believed was achievable if we made the right case, he said. And if you were wrong, she said, then we would have found out and we would have adapted. She paused. That's also something we do. He looked at her for a long time. He said, Dr. Asay Vasquez, the review panel's report has been filed. The reclassification is legal and complete. He paused. I want to say something that is not in the official record. She wait. He said, I have done this for 20 years. 5 operations, 5 species. None of them spoke to me. He paused. When you walked out and spoke, I knew the survey had made an error. He paused. Not immediately. Not from the language itself, though the language was remarkable. He paused. From the way you looked at me. She said, how did I look at you? He said, like you were assessing the situation. He paused, the same way I was assessing it. He paused. No resource species has ever looked at me the way another person looks at another person. She said, "What did you do when you saw that?" He said, "I kept following protocol." He paused. "That was wrong." She said, "You requested the review." He said, "After you cited the legal provision." He paused. "I should have done it before." She was quiet. He said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him. She held his gaze with the specific quality of someone deciding how to receive something. She said, "I appreciate that." She paused. "The formal record is more important. The precedent is more important." She paused. "But I appreciate it." She stood. She said, "Commodore." The review panel's report recommended updating the survey methodology to detect collective cognition. She paused. "We would be willing to contribute to that update. We have some thoughts on what it was looking for and what it missed." He said, "I'll transmit the request to the methodology committee." She said, "Please do." She left. He filed his final operational report for the Earth mission. In the commanding officer's notes section, which was optional and which he had never used in 20 years of operations, he wrote, "The survey error, in this case, was systematic and was identified and corrected through a review process that functioned as designed." He paused. "I want to note for the record that the identification of the error was possible because the assessed species made it possible. They learned our language, cited our law, and requested the review that the law provides." He paused. If they had not done this, the error would not have been identified. The classification would have stood. He paused. "The fact that the system worked in this case is partly a function of the review mechanism, which is sound. It is partly a function of the species that triggered the review, which recognized the mechanism and used it." He paused. "The system worked because the people it was supposed to protect made it work." Paused. "That observation has implications I am not qualified to develop, but that I believe someone should." He submitted the report. The methodology committee received the request. The human contribution to the updated cognition threshold survey methodology was submitted 8 months later by Dr. José Vasquez and a team of 14 cognitive scientists, linguists, and legal scholars. The contribution was 47 pages. It proposed a revised assessment framework that explicitly measured collective cognitive organization alongside individual cognitive capacity, included a detection protocol for intelligence expressed in language that the survey's language analysis had previously misclassified as non-evidential, and added a procedural requirement that any species that engaged with survey teams using the survey team's own language within the survey period be automatically flagged for expanded review. The committee adopted the methodology revisions in full. The survey was used on 11 more species in the following 30 years. The committee's records showed that in 3 of those 11 cases, the revised methodology produced a different initial classification than the original methodology would have. 3 species who might have been classified as resources were classified as sapient because of a linguist who had spent 42 days learning a language she had never heard. And the 43 people who had worked alongside her, doing what humans did, organized around a problem, together,